What if nothing was taken from you because it disappeared before you were old enough to remember it? There was no dramatic collapse, no warning on television, no single morning when everyone woke up and realized the world had changed. Instead, things became slightly worse. Then people adjusted, and after enough time had passed, the new way of living began to feel normal. The electricity became less reliable, public services became slower, homes became harder to afford, products stopped lasting as long. Work began following people home, and privacy slowly became something you had to explain. Older people noticed these changes because they remembered what came before, but younger people did not have that memory. They entered a world that was already different, and naturally, they assumed this was simply how the world worked. That may be one of the quietest forms of decline, not when something disappears, but when the memory of it disappears too. Most of us do not compare our lives with every possible version of society. We compare them with the world we first knew. The home you grow up in teaches you what a normal home looks like. Your first job teaches you what normal work feels like. The technology you use as a child teaches you how much privacy a person should expect. These early experiences become your baseline, and once something becomes part of that baseline, it becomes difficult to recognize it as a problem. Imagine a child growing up in a city where the power goes out almost every evening. The adults are frustrated. They remember when the lights stayed on. They remember when people did not need to keep candles, batteries, and backup generators ready. But the child remembers none of that. For the child, blackouts are simply part of the evening. You charge your phone whenever electricity is available. You avoid using the lift at certain hours. You keep a candle beside the bed. Nobody has to explain these habits. They are simply part of life. Years later, someone may tell that child that electricity used to be reliable. And strangely, that may sound like a luxury, perhaps even like an exaggeration. The older generation experienced the blackout as a failure. The younger generation experienced it as reality. Over time, it was not only the electricity that disappeared. The expectation of reliable electricity disappeared as well. The same thing can happen to public services. A process that once took one day begins to take a week. Later, it takes a month. A simple request now requires several forms, repeated phone calls, and a website that rarely works properly. At first, people complain. Then, they adapt. They learn which office to visit. They discover which document must be printed instead of uploaded. They share tricks with friends and family. Eventually, navigating the broken system becomes a skill. There is always one person who knows how to make it work. Ask Daniel. He knows which button to press. Daniel is not an expert in government systems. He simply discovered that the website only works with an old browser at 2 in the morning. The situation is almost funny. Almost. Because something important has changed. People are no longer asking why the system is broken. They are asking how to become better at surviving it. And the next generation may never see it as broken at all. To them, it is simply complicated. That difference matters. When people believe a system is broken, they may demand that it be repaired. When they believe it is naturally complicated, they are more likely to accept it. Privacy can fade in the same way. Usually it is not removed through one dramatic decision. It disappears through hundreds of small requests. Allow location access. Upload your contacts. Turn on the microphone. Accept all cookies. Verify your identity. Share your activity, so the service can give you a better experience. Each request seems small, and refusing usually makes life less convenient. So most people press the same button. Accept, continue, agree. Someone who remembers the world before smartphones may feel that something has been lost. They remember leaving the house without creating a permanent record of where they went. They remember buying something without seeing advertisements for it during the following week. They remember when private conversations were ordinary. But someone born into constant data collection may not feel the same loss. To them, tracking is simply part of using technology. It is how maps work. It is how recommendations are created. It is how applications recognize what you like. And because surveillance is presented as convenience, privacy can begin to look unnecessary, even suspicious. Why would you turn off your location? Why would you cover your camera? Why would you refuse to share your information? What are you trying to hide? Privacy does not always need to be banned. Sometimes it only needs to become difficult to defend. Housing gives us another example. The past was never perfect. Not everyone could afford a home, and access was never equal. But a society does not need to have been perfect in order to become worse. One generation may grow up believing that stable employment should eventually lead to a stable home. The next generation may believe that stable employment allows you to rent a small apartment. The generation after that may consider sharing a home with several strangers to be a normal part of adult life. People adapt because they have to. They buy smaller furniture. They keep fewer possessions. They avoid putting down roots because the next rent increase may force them to move. This flexibility is often presented as freedom, and for some people, it genuinely is. But sometimes people appear flexible because stability is no longer available. There is a strange process that happens when something becomes too difficult to reach. First, the goal becomes expensive. Then it becomes unrealistic. Finally, wanting it begins to look old-fashioned. You are told that you do not need to own a home. You are choosing a mobile lifestyle. You are valuing experiences instead of possessions. Sometimes that is true. But sometimes, a loss has simply been given better branding. The objects around us can also change our expectations. Many older appliances survive long enough to become unfashionable. Some newer ones barely survive long enough to leave their warranty period. The battery cannot be replaced. The case cannot be opened. The software is no longer supported. A small broken part cannot be repaired, so the entire product must be replaced. At first, this feels wasteful. After a while, it feels normal. A phone lasts a few years. A washing machine lasts until one important component fails. A smart device lasts until the company stops updating it. Then we buy another one, and another one. Over time, durability stops being a basic expectation. It becomes a premium feature. Repair becomes a specialist hobby, and ownership begins to feel temporary. A generation raised around disposable products may not feel cheated when something breaks. They may simply assume that the product has become old, even if it is only 3 years old. The object did not fail. Its time had simply arrived. A tragic but apparently natural lifespan. And once people accept that idea, manufacturers have very little reason to build things that last longer. Perhaps the most familiar example is work. There used to be a clearer boundary between being at work and being at home. That boundary was never perfect, but now the office can follow you everywhere. It sits inside your pocket. It waits beside your bed. And sometimes it vibrates at 11:47 at night. The message is usually harmless. Quick question, small update, just checking in. It rarely looks like work, but it still takes your attention. At first, being constantly available feels temporary. There is a deadline, a launch, a difficult week. But the difficult week never really ends. One urgent project is replaced by another. Teams remain understaffed. Everything becomes a priority. And exhaustion turns into a normal part of professional life. A young person entering this environment may assume that this is simply what a career feels like. They may not ask why every week feels like an emergency. Instead, they learn how to survive it. They organize their calendars, they track their sleep, they practice mindfulness. They become more efficient so they can handle even more work. Sometimes they attend a meeting about burnout during their lunch break. The responsibility quietly moves from the organization to the individual. If you cannot survive permanent overload, perhaps you need better time management. Perhaps you need more discipline. Perhaps you need greater resilience. The possibility that permanent overload is itself unreasonable is rarely discussed. There is a useful idea called the shifting baseline. It means that each generation measures the world using the conditions it personally remembers. Imagine a coastline that once had thousands of fish. The first generation remembers thousands. The next generation grows up seeing only hundreds. The generation after that sees 10. To the youngest generation, 10 fish may look normal, perhaps even healthy. Not because the sea has recovered, but because the memory of abundance has disappeared. Societies can change in the same way. We inherit roads, buildings, laws, and institutions. But we also inherit expectations, and expectations can slowly become smaller. The first generation says, "This is worse than it used to be." The second generation says, "This is how things are now." The third generation says, "This is how things have always been." That final sentence is the dangerous one. Because once people believe that a problem has always existed, they stop imagining that it could be solved. A broken machine can be repaired. A bad law can be changed. A failing institution can be rebuilt. But rebuilding an expectation is much harder. First, you must convince people that a better version of life is even possible. This is not an argument that everything was better in the past. It was not. People often remember the past selectively. They remember strong products, quiet streets, and affordable homes. They may forget discrimination, limited opportunities, dangerous workplaces, and problems that society has since improved. Many things have genuinely become better. Technology gives more people access to information. Medical treatments have advanced. Many forms of violence and discrimination are now less accepted. The point is not that history always moves backwards. The point is that progress in one area can exist beside decline in another. A faster phone does not automatically compensate for an unaffordable home. More entertainment does not automatically compensate for less free time. Convenient services do not automatically compensate for the loss of privacy. A society can become more technologically advanced while daily life becomes less stable. It can offer more choices while giving people less control. And because the decline arrives beside genuine progress, it becomes harder to notice. The screens are brighter, deliveries are faster, there are more things to watch, so life must be improving, right? It would be easy to blame younger people for accepting too much, to say they expect too little, to call them passive. But adaptation is not the same as consent. A person born inside a narrow room did not choose the size of the room. They simply learned how to arrange the furniture. The generation that never knew better is not weak. In many ways, it is extremely capable. It knows how to navigate unreliable systems. It knows how to live with uncertainty. It builds relationships through screens. It creates moments of happiness inside unstable conditions. The danger is not that this generation will fail to survive. It probably will survive. The danger is that survival will be mistaken for success, that coping will be mistaken for progress, and that a world people have learned to tolerate will be described as the best world realistically possible. So it may be worth looking at the ordinary frustrations in our lives. Not every inconvenience is evidence of decline, but some of them may be failures that became familiar. Which things do we accept today that would have shocked people 20 years ago? Which freedoms disappeared before younger people were old enough to notice them? Which expectations do adults still have today that children may one day consider unrealistic? Reliable electricity? A private conversation? A product that can be repaired? A home that feels permanent? An evening when nobody from work can contact you? A public service that simply works? These things do not disappear only when the final example is gone. They disappear when people stop believing they should exist. That is how decline protects itself. It lowers the standards slowly. It waits for people to adapt. Then, it waits for memory to fade. Eventually, the loss begins to look like normal life. Nothing needs to be taken from the next generation. It only needs to disappear before they arrive. Because you cannot miss a world you were never allowed to know.